Hello there, it's Tom here, and this is chapter 51 of Gunnerkrigg Court, The Tree. And my wife Magnolia is here to help me through this very fun chapter again.
I'm very excited to talk about this chapter.
Well, this was a pretty fun one that nobody had any problems with.
Of course.
Because this is the chapter in which Annie's dad comes back, and that is how I wanted to open it up, just straight up. The first time that the readers or Annie even realizes that Tony Carver has returned is he's suddenly one day teaching them in class.
And even the way that he's writing his name there on the wall, that's kind of a hint to his circumstances, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. We will find out pretty shortly that something's happened to his right hand, so he is trying to write with his left hand. I probably should have tried to make the handwriting a lot more messy, but I figured he'd probably practice a little bit, so even though he's writing with his non-dominant hand, it's not as messy as it should have been.
So we've seen Tony before in flashbacks when he's younger. So how he looks now, it's almost like a new design. What were you thinking about when you were drawing him?
Well, when it came to Tony, I wanted him to look very much like Annie, and I wanted his face to be very angular and severe, with some strange markings and scars on it. The most obvious scar is the one on his lip, but he also has a strange indentation on his nose, and I kind of wanted him to look like someone who might have been handsome when he was younger, and he still has some of that, but his face is kind of haggard and old now. But aside from the design of Tony, this chapter is a chapter that I've had a long time coming, and Annie will be facing some repercussions for stuff she's done in the past, and it's also a culmination of things that the audience has been expecting, but not really sure when these events will happen in the story. And this is really a point in the comic where a lot of things will start to change. For example, one of the first things that he tells her to do is to take off her makeup, which is a very big change for a character.
Would you describe what she's doing here in this page as disassociating?
I would, yeah, and that is really what's happening here. Annie, at the moment, she's been hit with kind of too much information, and she's kind of on autopilot, going to the bathroom, washing her makeup off, and then coming back. And the scene is drawn like this because Annie's super focused just on herself. And in the last panel you see that she's the only thing that is drawn with any sort of detail, kind of because I wanted to show this sort of an embarrassing scene for her.
You must have been very cognizant of how people would perceive Tony and how he would come across to readers. Do you remember what you were thinking about when you were writing him?
Yeah, I basically wanted to present Tony in the worst possible light. And one of the things that you might notice in this chapter, more so than a lot of other chapters, is that the background characters and his classmates are very visible in the background. Not only because this scene is taking place in the classroom, but also later on. I wanted to make sure that they were still present, even as an amorphous blob in the background. And the point of that was to show that she was aware of their presence. And this was all done intentionally to show Tony basically doing the worst job possible of a family reunion with his daughter. And I wanted it to seem like he is somebody who has just entered into Annie's life or the comic without any real thought or empathy or context of what she has gone through to this point. And he's almost casually inserting himself into her life and into the reader's reading experience. So after the class finishes and the rest of the classmates walk off, it is time for Annie to finally talk face-to-face with her dad. And even here he comes across as very stern and really not a nice guy.
Did readers respond to this character roughly the way you imagined they might?
Yeah, pretty much. I was hoping that by this point in the story, people had become invested in Annie's character and Annie's well-being. And so to have some guy come in and tear down some of the personal development that Annie has made would hopefully rile up the audience and really set a bad taste in their mouth.
Well, it is sad to see Annie not in control like she always tries to be.
And that is kind of what this chapter is about, is Annie sort of losing some of that control. In the previous chapter, which would be the beginning of book 6, Annie is very much in her element and she's comfortable with her situation. She's messing around with Coyote, she's in the ether, she's having fun in the forest. So this chapter is really a way of pulling the rug from her feet and undoing some of the progress that she's made.
Well, I think this is an interesting moment with the cheating because it does explain a little bit his standoffish attitude toward her, but not so much so that the reader can now fully sympathize with him.
Yeah, this is the scene where the fact that Annie has been subtly cheating in the past finally gets brought up and thrown back in her face, which is something that has been building for a long time. And even the fact that Kat is just outside the door as she hears the fact that Annie's been cheating off her work is also a little bit part of the embarrassment.
One of the things to me that makes Annie an interesting protagonist is that even though she's the main character, she's certainly not an open book to others or even to the reader. And there's some elements like this cheating thing where we had no idea what she was thinking of it, why she would even do it. So I guess this must have been an opportunity for you to show a little bit more of what was going on under the surface for Annie.
Yeah, as the readers, we only really know Annie from the point that she joins Gunnerkrigg, and we don't really know much of her history back in the hospital where she grew up. And Tony's the first person to come in with outside knowledge of how Annie was when she was younger, and I wanted this to be sort of a little hint that even though Annie has made great strides in coming out of her shell and showing more of her character to her friends and to the audience, there is still kind of a facade there that Annie's built up. One of them being that she would cheat off her friend and not really tell her about it. And Tony coming in and disrupting everything is just a way of showing that there's still elements to Annie's character that is kind of a question mark. So for me, I was really looking forward to writing this section because it's now we get a chance to see parts of Annie that are not just built up in Gunnerkrigg. Now we get to see some elements of her that existed before she entered the story. But it does unfortunately mean that Tony says that she's going to have to repeat year 9, which essentially means that she's going to be separated from Kat and the rest of her classmates.
I remember you telling me you felt this was kind of a harsh move on his part.
It was a pretty harsh move, but it's also a very calculated and logical move that really doesn't take into account that Annie has built her own life now, which is intentionally cruel of Tony to do. He's just looking at the numbers and realizing that she's not done the work that she should have done at school, and he is now taking steps to make sure that she makes up for that in clearly the harshest way possible.
In this conversation, I guess Annie's basically agreeing to everything that he's saying.
Yeah, he's kind of making some demands of her, some very serious ones too, and she's kind of going along with it. And up until now, we've seen that as Annie develops, she gets more and more rebellious, especially towards the rules that the court has set in place. And at this point, Tony, who comes back in, and really he has no idea that she's anyone other than the daughter that he last saw in the hospital. He is one of the authority figures that Annie's not had much experience in standing up to. So for now, what he says goes, even though this does leave Annie extremely despondent.
One thing I thought was kind of funny was that at around this time, readers seemed to be really upset, and they were saying things like that Coyote, Isengrin, and Renard were all better fathers to Annie than her own father was, whereas all Annie's father has done so far is say something admittedly very cruel to her, but Isengrin, Renard, and Coyote have all attempted to kill her or threatened extreme bodily harm, yet somehow that's more forgivable than what Tony's doing here.
Yeah, that's right. I think in the context of a story, people are a lot more willing to forgive things that are not really possible in the real world, even though if you were to think about the implications of some of the stuff that Isengrin and Renard and Coyote have threatened Annie with, they are pretty unforgivable. And so now we have a more plausible situation where a father comes back and rebukes his daughter for having cheated in homework, and she's now facing repercussions. That seems like a lot more unreasonable and unforgivable. So I think that's kind of an interesting situation. But so after all that happens and Annie flies off into space, we cut to later on in the day, and Kat is heading back from classes to catch up on the disaster that has happened, since she's not seen Annie for the rest of the day. And one of the things that I wanted to do with having the kids move into essentially the apartment from friends was present this fun, interesting, strange situation, and then now pulling that away from at least the readers. Kat and her classmates are going to experience this new life in their dorms, but Annie, unfortunately, is being pulled away from it. And so I kind of did this intentionally to tease the readers a little bit in showing this new situation, but now we're not really going to see much of the apartment or their life in there, since the comic's going to be focusing on Annie and her new living situation. And when Kat does run up to Annie and see her moving out, I wanted this image of Annie to be kind of shocking, where she's changed her hair and she looks very sullen, and she has kind of changed into an outfit that we don't normally see her in anymore. And so this new look for Annie is very shocking to the readers, but what I took care in doing here was showing that all she's done now is reverted back to what she used to look like in her flashbacks. When she started Gunnerkrigg, she had relatively short hair, and she did used to wear these sort of blue, very simple, plain cut dresses, especially in the flashbacks when we see her in the hospital. And all that's happened here is that she's reverted back to that, but I guess seeing her hair cut short and any sort of individual style from her clothes being removed from her is kind of a very jarring visual indication that she has been taken back to a period in her life where she's not done a lot of the character development that we, the readers, and Kat as her friend, have seen her make over the past few years. And this is very shocking to Kat.
But I remember you pointing out that for Annie, this shorter haircut is actually more normal for her, since she would have had it for most of her life and only grew her hair out in the 2 years or so that she was at the court.
Yeah, that's right. And I've always used her hair in a symbolic sense to kind of show her growth and personality. And in the past few chapters, her hair definitely has been more wavy and wild and longer and unkempt. And cutting her hair short visually takes all that away from her.
But would you say that this haircut for her, from her perspective, is her trying to return to something familiar and comforting rather than trying to diminish herself or something like that?
It definitely is, yeah. We will find out later the circumstances of her cutting her hair, but in a way this change in her character is a return to normalcy for her, and that will be explored later on in the upcoming chapters.
So this panel where Annie says that she worried Kat would think she was stupid if she told her about the cheating, it always kind of struck me as like maybe not the full truth and a little bit manipulative, because it's a pretty easy way to get Kat to forgive her for it. Is that something that you were thinking about at all, or is that just my interpretation of it?
Yep, no, that is kind of what I was going for here. While there might have been an element in Annie's personality where she didn't want to feel stupid, there is also an aspect in her cheating of Kat's work that is down to pure laziness. So she would have found it easy and convenient to cheat off Kat's work, and she probably knows on some level that if she tries to reframe it back on herself as if the reason why she was doing it is because she didn't want to come across as stupid, is probably a little way of, like you say, manipulating the situation a little bit here. And I also wanted this to seem very much like she's trying to steer the conversation away from the whole fact that she was cheating off Kat.
It's interesting to note how much the situation has changed, where in the beginning Annie's ownership of Renard was like an inconvenience to him, but now it seems like everyone's very upset that she would ever give that up.
Yeah, and it is kind of upsetting, and it is upsetting for Annie, because here she's really not dealing with anything that's happening. As we see in this page here, where Kat's pleading is sort of getting through to Annie, it's almost like Annie's just about to lose control of the situation. And she even says the words to that effect. It's clear that whatever is happening here with Annie and her dad is really not being processed yet, and Annie's still very much in autopilot. We're seeing it from Kat's point of view at this point, and it should be very confusing to Kat and the readers why Annie would go along with this, especially something as important as agreeing to give up ownership of Renard.
One thing I notice is in that second to last panel, Annie looks more like Tony than she has in the rest of the chapter. Was that intentional?
Yeah, that's definitely intentional, and a lot of the design crossover between Annie and Tony is extremely intentional. And later we will get a chance, for example, to see Tony when he's younger, and we'll see Surma, Annie's mom, when she's younger, and there is definitely a lot of crossover and combination of all three of their character designs, which is something that I wanted to focus on and kind of structure the comic around passively, not really as a main focus of the story, but that is something that interests me a lot when it comes to the behavior of the child compared to the behavior of the parents. And that's something that I wanted to get across visually as well. So once it's been made clear that Annie's not really processing the situation, Kat comes to the conclusion that all she can really do at this point is help her out. And at this stage, she knows Annie well enough to kind of go along with what Annie is doing and to be on her side and offer support. And that's something that I want to explore in the upcoming chapters as well. And so here, as we get to the end of the chapter, again we see the amorphous blob of background characters that represent Annie's classmates, and they all silently watch her move away, and they've seen the visual change in Annie as well, not only her hair and her outfit, but also the removal of her makeup. They see that she's not put her makeup back on, and I kind of wanted to have the removal of her makeup as fairly significant because I've made sure that nobody else in the comic is shown to wear makeup, and it is just Annie, and not even any of the other girls who are probably around her age in her class have decided to at least be represented as people who are wearing makeup. And so it is true to say that Annie's makeup is a little bit ridiculous, even though that's cruel for Tony to describe it that way. But at this point, all of the kids have known each other for a few years now, and they understand that that is just part of who Annie is. So even the removal of something that is a little bit strange on her is shocking to the other children, not in the sense that she finally looks like a normal teenage girl now, but more that in the sense that she's been visibly changed and she's very different to the Annie that they have come to know, even passively, just by being classmates to her. And so even though Kat is the closest to her, all the other kids in her class who may not know her so well can just visually see that Annie's gone through a big change. And I wanted to leave this last page as visual representation of Annie wordlessly travelling back into the court, away from the rest of her class. And when it came to doing the bonus page for this chapter, I knew that I didn't want to have some sort of light-hearted comic or an explanation of some sort. I just wanted a very clear, striking visual representation of this big, significant change that is taking place in Annie.
But I noticed you're still very careful to show the part in her hair that matches Tony's part.
That's right, yeah. So she is still the same person, and her hair, even beyond the bounds of where it's been cut, is still very present in the scene. So, as we'll see later on in the story, like the new parts of Annie that have developed since she's been at the court are not going to have been severed completely for her. They are just separated from her at the moment. And I was very much looking forward to working on scenes and story arcs that deal with the kind of two sides of Annie, the part that we, the readers, have come accustomed to, and the development she's made in the court and in the ether and in the forest, and then her childhood and past that have really kind of been left in limbo with the disappearance of Tony, that are now very much going to be brought to the fore now that he's back in the story. And that is the end of that chapter. So come back again for Chapter 52, Sneak.
Bye!